that. So we're going to go to introductions. So I'll go first, but maybe something like, your name, something about you, some opening thoughts. So hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a political philosopher. I'm particularly interested in the relevance of individual consent to the legitimacy of law. Why don't we go round? Tom, I see you there on my screen in the top left. Tom Swift, why don't you go next? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, I'm Tom Swift. This is not my real name. This is actually the name of my Substack blog. And my main interest right now is in studying decentralized societies. Sometimes I'm also I study the effects of um, how social media and basically virtualization has negatively impacted our own society. And on this blog, I describe various ideas relating to decentralization and the elimination of what I would call digital involution. So if you're interested, here it is in the meeting group chat. Other thing I would say is that I'm a software developer, and I enjoy reading history. My main interests are electrical engineering, history, science in general, and science fiction. So that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. It's great to have you with us. Big fan of decentralization too, so lots to compare notes on there. John DeWitt Walsh, I see you next on my little lineup on the screen. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm John. This is my first time joining one of these salons, so it's great to see all of you. I'm excited to get into it. I guess when it comes to like what ideas of freedom I'm particularly interested in right now, I don't know. I've kind of recently gone through a quiet, but I think quite radical reevaluation, at least for myself, on what I think freedom means. So I'm still in a sense of what I'm figuring out, but I guess something I would like to explore here is like how would a utopian society kind of resolve the many tensions that I think plague the kinds of competing freedoms I think we have to grapple with in practically every society we fashion. So like how would the most perfect society resolve those tensions, particularly when it comes to freedom of expression and the ideas we're allowed to express publicly?
Great. So like all the big ones. That sounds good to me. James. Hi, James. How you doing? James Crocker. Hey, great to have you with us.
I'm doing well.
Good times.
Hi. Yeah, good to see you again.
Hey.
So yeah, I'm James Crocker. I'm based in Washington, D.C. By background, I studied philosophical theology, but now I work in researching sort of best practices for corporate compliance. So I'm sort of on the other end of the spectrum for freedom, um, although maybe in ways that are good. Um, so um, when it comes to what I'm like questions I'm interested in, I suppose a lot I wonder about things vaguely a lot of the time. When I was thinking about this um, event, I suppose my first thought was, why does anyone have any power in Utopia? But then that kind of led me to thinking about like, well, if power you mean like the ability to direct your own actions, then everybody has power in Utopia. And then you know, you immediately get into problems of conflicts depending on the kind of people you think inhabit Utopia, I suppose. So I don't know. I don't know that I have a very specific question, but I'm interested in the topic and yeah, interested to hear what people have to say.
That's right. Well, as a philosopher, always keen to interrogate the question, and obviously, like, what is power? Seems like a great
Mm,
starting point, like that.
mm.
Trey, hi. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was attracted to the group because I'm also part of the Tocqueville reading group, and it's my first time really reading Tocqueville. I kind of read it, I don't know, 20 years ago maybe. Um, but I'd forgotten it all by now. And so it didn't resonate so much then, as it does now. But as far as if I want to get something specific in Utopia, I'm kind of curious about the role of associations in how they will form as more of an act of governance than actual laws, which seems to be kind of a direction. I wouldn't say we're headed there, but it's like things just work better when it happens that way. So anyway, that's my take.
Nice. That's great. That's super interesting. I really like that. David Ballard, over to you. You got it? Okay, well, David, we'll come back to you. Let's let you work out the meeting. Jess, let's go to you while David works out his. Shall we? Is that okay?
Hi, I'm Jess. Nice to be here. I'm also at work, so apologize if I have to move away or do anything. I am also in the Tocqueville reading group, and so I am interested in this topic for much of the same reasons Trey said. But also I think it's a fascinating question, and I grew up like with my grandmother, who was sort of uh, like a philosopher of her own. Like she wasn't she was like a self-taught philosopher, and she studied a lot of things, religion a lot. And I remember we used to always talk about um, utopia in terms of like this communist idea of like what people think communism would be. And my grandmother used to always say that because she was a very religious woman, that only in heaven can you have communism, because humans instinctively could never live in a society that way and treat each other that way. And so I always believed it the same way about utopia. Like we could never really live in a utopian society because humans instinctively haven't evolved enough to be like the way to each other. We're still too animalistic to live in like an actual utopian society. But I'm excited for the conversation. Oh, and I think I don't know, were you the person that published the article about baby pods?
Yeah, about yeah, like the idea of basically fetuses being gestated in machines.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We had a
Yeah.
very long conversation back and forth in the Discord on that. And I really enjoyed the article. I'm a big, I think I think it's an exciting topic to explore in the future. But I don't know if you saw that in the Discord, but a lot of people like went back and forth on that.
I saw a little bit of it after I joined the Discord, so I sadly missed it at the time. But yeah, I was really happy to know from Anna that people had been like reading it and arguing about it. That's kind of the dream, to be honest, as a philosopher, that people are gonna like engage with what you're saying and particularly like push back against it, or come to like views about it and stuff. So that makes me very happy. I'm really glad you liked it. Thanks, that means a lot. And that's very interesting about your grandma as well. I like that thought. One thing I'm quite interested about Utopia, I suppose, is the idea of how people might change.
Baby at night. It damn sure wasn't last night. Black freedom, I tried. I'm telling you, bruh. That man is darker than his face.
Sorry, some noise on the line.
And if that's not a real picture, like, you tried. That like a nigga and like.
I think you can mute people as the host.
Yeah, I'm just not sure where it's coming from. Oh. There we go. I don't know where it's coming from, but anyway, cool. Hi. Yeah, so one thing I guess I'm quite interested in is like how Utopia might change the people in Utopia, because there's some argument, isn't there, that says, you know, you want people in Utopia to be free to be bad, because if you don't allow them to be free to be bad, it's going to be so authoritarian. But then maybe when people live in really good conditions, and Rawls makes an argument like this, when people live in really just conditions, maybe they'll become more just. And I think this kind of resonates with what your grandma was saying, Jess, which is something like, maybe at least people on Earth as we currently are, aren't going to behave in the ways we might expect from people in Utopia. But maybe if people had the chance to live in the conditions that we might associate with Utopia, maybe it might have the effect on us that we might become better. And of course, that's kind of chicken and egg, isn't it? And but one of the values about thinking about it in terms of a thought experiment might be to think how we might change if we lived in better conditions. That's one way around to look at it anyway. So yeah, I'm very interested to think about those things. Let's go. David, have you managed to make your muting situation? Yes, you have.
I have, thank you. Yeah, I was on an old device and who knows why it wouldn't work today. I'm David Ballard. I'm outside of Philadelphia. Go Eagles, Super Bowl and all that. I'm a retired economist and I'm also an elected official in our local government. So I mean, a very small municipality, so it's not a lot of power, but it does exist, and a lot of the power is related. I've found to information, and the people who often think that they know what I should do don't know what's going on. And I think the relationship to the information that's available about a situation or dilemma and power might be an interesting wrinkle that's worth thinking about. You'd be amazed how many people know precisely what to do. And often it's hard to figure out, what is the best alternative and what the ramifications would be of following a particular course. So, in the abstract, power and utopian sort of human relations maybe can be easily drawn, but I think your real situations are often hard. So it kind of raises the question for me is what, if given utopia, what does power mean? So I'm interested in hearing what everyone thinks and chiming in where I can.
It's a nice way of framing the question. It's good to have a power holder with us, indeed. That's useful. That's wonderful. Thanks, David. Adam, hi. How's it going?
Hi, so I'm Adam. I'm also a political philosopher, and my interests in the topic, I'm wondering if freedom and utopia are compatible. So utopia, you have to have a vision of what the perfect or ideal society is like, and in order to ensure that society matches that vision, you have to interfere with people's freedoms. I'm also curious about to what extent utopia, the idea makes sense, given that under conditions of freedom, people will disagree about what the perfect society looks like. So it may be that in a free society, there's really no such thing as utopia because everyone has their different ideas about this. And so following Tom's example, I was going to just push. I'm doing an inter-intellect salon in about a month's time. That's a discussion with Robert Talese on his book Civic Solitude, and that's about themes of democracy, polarization, and the role of solitary reflection in overcoming and sort of turning down the heat of contemporary politics. And so I'm going to just paste a link to that if you're interested, but I thought there might be some overlap where people in this group might like to attend that. So there it is.
Thanks, Adam. That sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds really great. Now, Keshav, I think we have.
Hi, I'm Keshav. I cover generative AI. I write a newsletter on generative AI. I have a budding theory that we cannot have utopia, and the version of it that we can achieve, I call it Carnot's utopia. So there's a concept in physics that the maximum efficient heat engine cannot have 100% efficiency. Even the maximum efficient engine will have less than 100%, which will be say 75, 80%. So since there are many conflicting rules that people will have for ideals for an utopia, hence we cannot have the 100% efficient ideal world we can live in. So that, but, and I think in, if we ever reach that state, those priors that we agree upon are the, those ideas are the truly the thing that holds power in utopia, in that world. And we can extend that to people that who are the final cohort of people that decides, okay, these are the agreed upon priors that we work upon in this world. So then those people have the power.
That's very interesting. I mean, I guess like one question I've got for you as a philosopher is something like, and this is going to totally depend on your definition of utopia, but like if utopia has to be something that's possible, and if the thing we want or we'd imagine utopia to be isn't possible, then you get like a second best world, don't you? Which is something in the economist sense, which is something like, well, if that thing's not possible, then that's not utopia. Therefore, utopia is just less good than we expect it to be, but it still counts as utopia. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I think so. It might end up meaning utopia is really bad, but anyway, let's come back to that. Yeah, that's very interesting, Keshav. I love that. I like the way of framing it very much. Now we also have, sorry, your name is just coming up as C. Hi, C. How's it going? Sorry, maybe that's not a good identifier. Yes, if you're here and you haven't spoken, I think you're the only person who hasn't spoken. Your name is showing up and your photo showing up, but your name is only showing up as the letter C. If you wanna introduce yourself, okay, all right, we'll come back to you. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not sure how I can message you. Otherwise, I would. Okay. Well, if you wanna introduce yourself and come back in, please do. Otherwise, we're gonna press on. So I'm just gonna talk for a little while about some thoughts I've been having, and please be getting ready with your questions and complaints and your responses and your thoughts, because I really want this to be a debate. So just a quick explainer first about the kind of title of this series, and some of the ways I've been thinking about this, and which engages actually with a load of the points you've just been making. So I'm writing this book called Freedom in Utopia. I'm very interested in freedom. It's a book about freedom, and particularly it's a book about how free we'd be in the best possible society. So my basic thinking is something like, a lot of people over time have used the idea of utopia to think about what a good society or even the best society would look like. But most of the famous, oh, hi, we have a message from C. Okay, cool. Okay, great. It's great to have you with us. Like I say, no laws and enforcement here. So please just take part as exactly as you'd like to. It's really great to have you with us. And thanks for the message. Really appreciate it. Just want to make sure you knew that you were, you had the opportunity to speak if you wanted to. So my thought is something like, if you think of the kind of famous depictions of utopia, whether it's philosophy books or novels, sci-fi films, oftentimes the utopias as opposed to the dystopias have a lot of good stuff going on. So they're usually like safe, quite peaceful, abundant, but oftentimes the people aren't very free. So in Thomas More's Utopia, everyone wears the same clothes. In Paper's Republic, the kids are taken away from their parents to be educated by better people, as he might call it. Seems not very free. And I think this might tell us something about a kind of failing in standard ways to think about the relation between freedom and the good. So with the Plato thing, it's the idea that, smart people, the people who are like, meet some kind of condition of education or something, should be in charge of children. I mean, this seems to me deeply wrong. But beside that, one thing it seems to be is deeply unfree. So in this context, I'm interested in thinking about utopia in terms of what it can tell us about freedom. So a freedom-focused kind of point of view around what the best possible society would look like. And the reason I'm using that best possible society approach, and I do get that some of the classic depictions of utopia wouldn't meet that definition. So for instance, some people, when they think about utopia, they don't think about a society, they might think about a world, like think of Voltaire or something. But for me, a useful feature of this definition is it gives us 3 constraints. So if you think about best, particularly if you think about it in some kind of objective sense, then you have to aim super high because some things are either required or they're ruled out. So if you're thinking about what would be best for human beings, as opposed to, say, meeting our subjective preferences, you might say something like, well, look, we just know in the best possible society people wouldn't starve. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case, but we're going to have some kinds of conditions that need to be met. Or we might say in the best possible society, it would have to be the case that you're free to express yourself in line with your religious beliefs. Again, I'm not necessarily
Could
saying
you
that's
clarify? Could I
Yes,
ask
of
you to
course.
clarify? So I spend a lot of time traveling the world, visiting places that are utopias or more utopian than the place in the United States where I live. And
Yeah.
you can disaggregate utopias into 2. One is a utopia with selective admission, a utopia that only allows 1 out of 100 humans that are carefully selected to enter. And then there's a utopia that allows everyone who wants to enter. It seems to me those are 2 totally different visions of utopia. If you want to have a productive conversation, could you clarify which of those 2 are you trying to discuss here?
Well, I mean, so I think I'm taking a slightly different approach to this in that I'm using utopia as a kind of thought experiment. So I'm not really talking about real world places. I'm just talking about it in a sense of what the institutions and laws and rules of a society would look like in order for it to count as something that would meet these 3 conditions of best possible in society. So, like I say, the best constraint would rule out some things and rule in certain other things. The possible constraint, I'm not talking about like if we all could fly or if we all could live forever. I'm talking about stuff that's possible today or tomorrow or maybe next year. So I'm willing to consider things like vastly less scarcity of goods, for instance. That might well change, for instance, our moral requirements. It might well change our expectations. And then in terms of society, and this I think comes partly to your point around who the members are, it may well be the case that I would be the most free if I ran off and lived by myself in the woods. But that's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking how free could we be in the best possible society, on which society means a place with institutions and laws and societal norms. So we have some constraints. We set those constraints so that we can ask exactly the kinds of questions that you're posing. So one question would be like, who counts as a member of Utopia? Once you have the people living in Utopia, who can join? How do people exit? What does that mean? But for my purposes, on some level, that's a second order question. Doesn't mean it's formally less important in objective sense. It just means that I'm trying to set some rules of the game such that we have a starting point to be able to address those questions. So one way of looking at it would be to say, how should immigration policy be set? So you can either say, look, we have the society that we have, and it's this particular country X, and therefore in the conditions we have, this is how we set immigration policy. Another way of looking at it is saying, look, if you had the best possible ordered society on these particular conditions I'm setting, then how would you go about addressing these particular matters like cultural policy, education, immigration? So I think 2 differences between our approaches is, one, I'm not considering that there is anywhere that counts as utopia today. I'm not even sure there's anywhere that counts as democracy, but maybe we'll get onto that in a moment when we think about the political orderings of societies. But certainly on the kinds of constraints I'm setting, there is no utopia. There is a big question, I agree, about if there were a utopia, what would the requirements be to allow extra people to come into that place? For instance, we talked about this last time, for those of you who are here. Catherine, who was with us that time, who's not here today, posed this really interesting question about, like, would it be utopia if there were other people living in other places which weren't good? is the condition of utopia that everyone who is currently alive is a member of it? I think that's a really great question. So just to finish off, now I've kind of set the picture. The particular thing that I thought we'd talk about today is kind of power and legitimacy. So like I say, this is something I'm particularly interested in as a political philosopher. If you've looked at any political philosophy, the late 20th century was kind of revolutionized in terms of political philosophy by these guys, Rawls and Nozick. A lot of the big stuff they looked at were things around justification for laws and justice and rules in society. One of my grand aims for my book is that it will be part of the kind of social contract canon. So these are these texts which you originally got people like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau writing, but then in the 20th century we get Rawls, we get people like the great contemporary political philosopher Tommy Shelby writing, on which there's this idea that like something like the authority of the governors comes from the consent of the governed. This is quite a standard view, but a lot of people have a lot of problems with that as a formal condition on society, whether it's a necessary or sufficient condition. And if you take a hardcore view of this sense of having a consent condition, it doesn't just mean that the people in charge are only justified if they have your consent. It's like the laws only bind you if you've consented. And on the flip side, if you have consented, then those laws bind you. Like if you've consented, the laws bind you no matter what, which is pretty hardcore. It's a real problem with the social contract condition. So with regards to utopia in that context, some questions would be things like, how free should you be able to make your own decisions? At which point, at which kind of level, political level, should the decisions be made? So what's made at the local level, what's made at the regional level, the federal or state level, depending on where you live, the national level. What gives the people who hold power authority? So even in your own household, if you're ordering your kid around, what gives you the authority to do that? I'm not saying you don't have the authority. I'm just asking, what is it that gives you that thing that your neighbor doesn't have? Similarly, we have an elected representative with us. What is it that gives that person this power? It's an interesting question, and to pin it down isn't always as easy as we might think. So the argument I'm making in my book is the final thing I'll say, and I'm turning over to you in a second, is my kind of answer to these questions is, and we've already talked a little about this, various of us, about decentralization. My answer is a radically decentralized democratic kind of argument. So my view is something like decision-making power should always be held at the lowest possible effective level. So not the lowest possible efficient level. There may be more efficient ways, but they may not be justified. I'll come back to that if necessary. But what I'm basically saying is something like we have the right to be involved in the decision-making that affects us, and also the right to hold to account decision makers whose decision affect us. So I make this argument in part in reliance on a consent condition, but I use a bit of a different conception of consent from some of, at least the critics of consent theory. Anyway, over to you. So let's go around. Basically, all these questions are up for grabs. We can start, if we like, with something like, who holds power, or where's the point that the power holds, what authorizes the power? Who wants to go first? James, you look like you have thoughts.
Yeah, sorry, I was just taking notes. I guess my initial thought is when you use a construction like best possible society, with my background, that reminds me of discussions about best possible worlds in sort of philosophy of religion. So there's this idea that God's under an obligation to build a best possible world, and what does that look like? And there's many arguments about that from people who just deny that that's a constraint on God. And one of those denials, probably the most interesting one I've heard, is that there just is no such thing as a best possible world. And that I suppose I think you could make the same case for utopia, that there's just no such thing as a best possible society. And I guess the argument would have to run that whatever condition you mean by best, there's going to be some way of increasing it. So, okay, a society, the best society is one in which everybody is like maximally happy. I'm sure there's lots of problems with that, but if that's an example, okay, fine. Now, what if you just have a society with twice as many people? Like, is that a better society? Like, maybe not, because everybody, yeah, I don't know. So that's not a very well thought through question, but I guess my initial thought is like, I feel like an objection, you could probably formulate an objection along the lines of just there is no such thing as a best possible society.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So there's a kind of there's a flippant response, which is literally just top of the line kind of answer, isn't there? We might all of us, all, 12 of us, however many of us there are, be really bad at playing croquet, but one of us is going to be better than the rest of us. Therefore, that's the best. But if we want to set any objective limit on this, that just may not be good enough for us really to want to count that in a substantial sense. In
So
the same way that one of us might be the best murderer, but we just might not want to use the word best to associate with that kind of thing. So on a thicker conception, you just might not want to use that word. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I guess I would say that's where possible comes in, because like best of a set is not the same thing as best possible. So
Depends
like,
on it depends on how you count possible, doesn't it? If it just means possible in
well,
the
that
sense of
was,
currently the case that these are the members of the set. But
yeah,
again,
I
that
mean,
sounds like a flippant answer.
that was going to be kind of my second question is, and you answered a little bit, is like, what kind of possibility are we talking about here? But that's kind of another, I mean, you answered that a bit, but I think Tom wanted to come in.
Yeah, Tom, hi.
yeah, so I think James had a very interesting point there regarding happiness. And I would say from my studies of history that certainly happiness maximization is, I would say, one of the worst ways to justify how effective a society is. For instance, you could arguably say that our society provides large amounts of happiness through the dopamine induced by, say, cell phones or video games or other such devices. And yet it's obvious that this is terrible from a utopian perspective, since this form of power is not governmental, but yet it's exerted on us largely without our will. We often find ourselves forced to use systems specified by other people for the benefit of other entities without our consent. So in terms of decision making and who holds the power, I believe that at this point in time, and I agree with you there, Rebecca, you had a great point. Power is far too centralized. And I believe that any sort of the scientific or technical progress of mankind has happened under conditions where decentralization was fairly extreme. For instance, I would say maybe the 13th to the 19th centuries in Europe, in what were called the free cities. So that would be this area of entities, I would say, all the way from Switzerland up through some of the German states, up through the Hanseatic League region. And Venice would be maybe the southernmost extreme of this area. What I would say is that you cannot truly have consent of the governed in a situation where you have mass society. If you go above a few million people per political unit, any form of democracy starts to fail, which is, of course, why the Roman Empire did. I believe it's therefore any utopia must provide the option to live in a myriad different societies.
I think
Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry, Rebecca.
no, just go for it.
I was going to jump in there because like, and Trey might want to jump in too. This is kind of like part of what we've been talking about with Tocqueville in this chapter that we read on the Native Americans. And one of the things that I found fascinating was how Tocqueville wrote about the Native Americans and how they lived in the wilderness and they had this wonderful, happy life essentially. And then, the Europeans came in and brought them liquor and all of these goods, which were supposed to make them happy, but then made their lives miserable. But it was like a power grab. And then they were like, well, now, we're going to take your land from you. And they started pushing them back. And I think it's really some of the things that what like James and Tom were talking about in these societies. Once you start offering more things to people that are basically making them happy or supposed to make them happy, then they're going to want more, and it's going to off balance society, and it makes it more difficult for the consent. And that's when it brings it back to this utopia. Where do you put limitations on how happy or non-happy people are going to eventually be, which is one of those things that and it's funny because I'm not even a religious person. It was like, Adam and Eve and the apple. I mean, it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve and the apple. Like, they were in the Garden of Eden. They were supposed to be the happiest, but they wanted the apple. Or like the veil of ignorance. Like, as soon as you take off the veil of ignorance, like it's all of these things. Like, once you lift that up and then all of these things occur, then you start to realize and you're going to want more, but it's going to break down certain parts of the society. So I would be curious about that.
I think that's a great point. I'd certainly say, for me, I don't think happiness can be a sufficient thing. I think it's concerning. I think, like Tom says, if you want to, judge a society, and I'd say that pretty much on any broader metric, whether it's about how free it is or how good it is, happiness isn't can't be the only thing you look at. Not least because, as you say, Jess, happiness is, well, depending on the kind of happiness you're talking about, there's probably a difference between the immediate happiness you get from having a glass of wine and the deeper, fuller happiness you might get from, I don't know, loving somebody or learning about Tocqueville, living a good life in a fulfilled, the kind of Aristotelian eudaimonic thing. There's this great line Robert Nozick has, which is something like, setting some rule such that you only have a glass of wine after 7 o'clock in the evening. And that annoys you when it's 6 o'clock and you look at your fridge and you want to go and have a glass of wine. But in a deeper sense, the point is that you're recognizing that you gain fulfillment from going on with doing your work and constraining yourself. So it's like a kind of second order thing, isn't it? It's like there's the immediate, and I think that's the point about trading on the idea of giving people something to give them this kind of easy, quick fix, which actually ends up destroying the greater fulfillment that they have in their way of life, which is so deeply sad. So yeah, that's a really great point. Keshav, do you have
Yeah,
something to
I
add on
have.
this one?
Yeah. So since we started with that, we should have an incremental utopian society instead of starting with already an utopia. So by that means, if let's say we are a group of 12, and if we pick anyone to be the person of power, any one of us, and then have a system to keep us in check and rotate the power, which is essentially democracy, mm, then we will have after some time, we will have the best possible version of who's the what distribution of power is the best possible version for our group, our subset. But then I randomly had the idea that do people have the freedom to not claim power in that system? And another point from Tom's session point, that you can have subunits of utopia, uh, which different types of utopia, which might not be similar to each other across all aspects. Let's say you can have metrics to judge a utopia. Happiness could be one metric, technological progress could be another, or the mm, human life, the age of the age distribution of a society could be another metric. So those all subunits might not be similar on all of those levels, but under under the combination of, let's say we are achieving 75% on this, but 80% on this, they meet some minimum required criteria. So that could be a world we could possibly call as a best possible version we have. And then based on the legitimacy, that we could allow permeation of people, that if you are from a subunit which has this metric at this level, you are allowed to permeate into another subunit which has the same metric at certain level. So you can have rules for the permeation between these subunits.
So that's super interesting. So are you seeing this as like a kind of effect of utopian living or a condition on it? So is it that people kind of order themselves in these ways? So you have the subunit and it happens to gravitate around valuing this thing? Or is it more that there's a kind of top-down distribution of like, hey, this is going to be the place where this is valued? I mean, is this a kind of evaluation method, or is this the people in this area have chosen to govern themselves in this way?
I think we could start with a baseline, and then people will order themselves into on different
Interesting.
subunits.
So is this reminds me a little bit, it's a different version of the Nozick. Have you read the Nozick Utopia's stuff in Anarchy, State, and Utopia?
No, I haven't read much
You might
philosophy at
like
all.
it. It's really cool. So he wrote this great book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which we talked about last time, actually, a little bit, for those of you who are here. So it's more famous, to be honest, for its stuff about the state. But there's a really cool section, a short section about Utopia, and he comes up with this idea that Utopia is kind of a utopia of utopias. And I think you might like this. It kind of resonates quite strongly with some of the stuff you're saying, which is very interesting. Adam, what do you think? I mean, we have a Rawlsian here, and of course, Nozick and Rawls were kind of, I mean, there's all a crossover, but they were sort of also kind of at odds. What do you think? Where do you think legitimacy lies? Where do you think where would you make a start on this big question?
Well, I was actually, I wanted to ask you about the role of consent in Utopia. So I assume you're talking about explicit consent, and you were saying that you want the unit of government to be the lowest possible efficient level, I think. So
Effective, yeah, lowest possible
effective.
level, yeah.
So I was wondering if what you have in mind is small political units in which people can join through explicit consent and remain in the unit through explicit consent and engage in self-government. But there's something like a size constraint on what can constitute well, I mean, if you have a society of 1 million people, 1 million people are not going to be able to explicitly consent to the rules that they're following under. So, are you endorsing something like a utopia as a collection of small communities that are bound by like Lockean explicit consent, and the problem to who rules is just it's all the size of communities is sufficiently constrained so that self-government is possible. Is that how you're thinking of things?
Yeah, sort of, although I think I'm thinking about it the other way around, which cashes out largely like that. But I guess I'm thinking about it something along the lines, if you were to think of the kind of concentric circles of where power lies in a political society, there might well be some things that you think have to lie at the center. So if you have a society which is part of a world where there are other societies, you want to have some kind of defense policy, unless we end up in some kind of perpetual peace, which seems unlikely. Big fan of Yorkshire, but I don't think it makes sense for Yorkshire to have its own defense policy. So you probably think that regardless of the size of the state, and it might well be 1 million, it might well be 60 million, you're probably going to say that something like defense policy might well happen in the center. Now, you might not think that's the case, but you're going to have a stronger argument for making that over defense policy than some other things. It also strikes me that there are some things which quite clearly lie at the individual level or the household level. So, what time your kids go to bed, within, some reasonable bounds. Normal time should be the business of the parents. the way you talk to your girlfriend, your boyfriend, those kinds of things are a matter for interpersonal decision making. Again, that's not to say that there aren't some things, if you choose to stab your kid or your partner, that's a matter for the police. That seems reasonable. But some basic interactional stuff is at the individual level, some is at the household level. Similarly, now you might want to argue all day about how you determine, the flowers at the local park. But I think, local people should have a say about that. And similarly, the way that your streets are ordered or the way the bins are collected. I'm not saying you all have to be spending all of your time doing that, but if the people are coming around collecting the bins at 2 in the morning, waking your kids up, there seems that one of the problems with that is it's your business. So I think what I'm saying is like, what are the levels at which it's your business that you should have a say in the thing? And there are some things where it seems more reasonable that it might well happen at the central point, regardless of how many people are in the society. But there's a load of things where it seems like minimally you should get some kind of say over that at the individual level. And the group of you who live in that particular area should have some kind of say. There are different ways in which that might be. It might just be you have a say in the sense of holding to account the people who are elected to have a say over it. But one thing I feel quite strongly, and this is slightly separate from the book, is that the UK is a highly, highly politically centralized state. So if you think of something like tax policy, our tax policy is more centralized than France, and people who think about tax policy find that shocking. Even our property taxation and stuff, things like council tax, effectively go back through Westminster. So all I'm saying is something like, we have the right, I'm not even just saying it's in our interests or it's more economically efficient. We have the right to have a say in stuff that is our business, stuff that affects us. So yes, the way I would cash it out is probably going to end up being lots of local, little, small groups. But I see it more like these concentric circles, such that you have the powerful level of the individual, the powerful level of the household, the powerful level of the street, the powerful level of the council, the district, the area. The interesting question then is what you allocate to which level. And I just want to say something like, look, if it can be done effectively at a lower level, then it should be. Even if it would be more efficient, it may well be the most efficient thing just to have the state to determine all these things. Maybe it's most efficient to have the state to determine all of our bins should be collected at 3 a.m. in the morning, even if it wakes up your kid. All I'm saying with that is one problem about that beyond anything else is it's your business. You should have a say in that. It might be costly at the efficiency level, but you should get a say in that. So something like that. So we're going to cash it out in the same way. I just think I'm coming at it from asking the opposite question. Does that make sense?
So when you talk about the best possible society, in your view, you're not making any claims about what would happen in the best possible society other than
Yeah, so one thing I think you're coming on to is on my view, we don't know very much about it because it's up to them.
yeah,
My picture of Utopia ends up being very thin because it's up to the Utopians to make the decisions. It's up to the Utopians to say the stuff. It's up to the Utopians to do the stuff, right? You're not going to get a very rich picture of Utopia on my conception because my point is it's up to them. Trey, you look like you want to say something. Join us, say something. What's your thought?
I'm just processing what you just said about your take on Utopia. It's up to the people to come up with, which that's just not what I hear. I want you to tell me the answer. I don't want to have to come up with the answer myself. Like, what's up with this? But I did have a second thought on the trash cans. I was thinking earlier about power and who gets it on the local level. At some point, it's like, all right, trash is going to be picked up probably on a weekly basis. And you know what? You tell me when you're picking it up. And then I'll have the can out there, whatever, the last thing the night before. But like, I don't know that a different day makes a difference. And then all of a sudden you brought up, well, if they're picking up in the middle of the night and waking everybody in the neighborhood up, then that's a problem. Like, well, yeah, that is a problem. I wasn't thinking about that. And so it's like, it comes back to is like, when problems are on that arise, I think this goes to what you're saying, when locals can handle it, that's when things work out for the better, maybe, because if your system is countrywide or, you know, some massive region, even in the United States, statewide would be massive. You know, it's like the trash is like you can't just change when it's picked up. But if it's, you know, a town, a small city or whatever, then yeah, it gets a little easier to handle. And that may be the general theme of Utopia, is when the people can handle more of the issues than not, then that's when Utopia gets created or becomes more of a reality. If that makes any sense at all.
Totally makes sense. And I think one of the things I'm interested in is like, I feel as if one of the problems of having of over delegating these decisions, so getting people to make decisions that are actually your business to have a say in, is that it can be infantilizing. So I don't know, when you go on the tube and you have these posters saying be kind to each other. And believe me, I'm all up for people being kind to each other. But if you're constantly being told to be kind to each other, one risk is that you forget to, decide to do that for yourself or come to that conclusion for yourself. And similarly, I think there's a difference between the outcome in which, and you're right, I think one benefit of local decision making is usually like local needs and preferences are best known by the people who are local, right? You know that actually there's a ridge in your street such that if the car runs over it at 2 a.m, it's going to make a loud noise. But you coming to that conclusion and someone else coming to that conclusion has a difference in terms of the reasoning that takes place. So the two consequences could be the same, but the reasoning might be different. And one advantage of you making that decision as a local person isn't just that your better information drives a better outcome. It's that you've had a say in it. It's that you've done it. It's that it's good for you to do it. So I think one thing I'm arguing is that as reasoning creatures, who are also social creatures, it's costly to us if we don't get a say in stuff that's our business. It's costly if we don't come together as a group to deliberate and come up with solutions to our local problems. So yeah, everywhere needs trash cans collecting, but there's a real cost if we just outsource all of these things. Something like that, I think. Now, Jess, you have something to say at this point?
Yes, I was just answering Tom. I think what I was trying to say is that it's easier to meet these constraints without like globalization, current technology, when we had civilization really spread out. I think it's easier to meet these constraints. And when you were talking about like trash can pickup and all of this stuff, it's like, I think it's very difficult. It always like, this is a pop culture reference. And so I forgive, or please forgive me if anybody hasn't seen Battlestar Galactica before, but I always think about the ending of Battlestar Galactica when they landed on like the new planet and they basically say, destroy all the technology, we're starting over again. And it's like, that's their utopia. And they realize that they have to like destroy all the technology and start over again fresh. And so I think that that's not going to stop mankind from wanting to get better again, which goes back to the original argument. Like, how do you stop people from wanting to better themselves or wanting more? But like these constraints are difficult within like our current, like 2025 and like how we are today.
Here, I've got a question. I've got a statement to make about that. I would actually say that these problems are easier to solve than many of you may realize. For instance, there's a lot of the way the world works today, and then there's also how society tells us the world works today. For instance, there's sort of this general idea that you're supposed to live in a large city if you're smart and do what everyone else around you is doing. And there's this societal expectation that you are on social media and that you are supposed to watch Netflix. Enough technology exists today that if we were to assume local control and establish society, say in hinterlands of the United States, that's the great thing about this country. There's just so many empty places. I mean, really empty land that I believe you can pretty much still do whatever you want. But to get back to your point, Jess, I think the best thing to do is that all societies should work together to increase the total number of resources and land area available to mankind, which I believe is why space travel is important so that we can establish new domains in which to form new societies, so that the number of societies that could form is potentially unlimited.
I'm a big fan of the space stuff.
So
And yeah, this is a super interesting question about, as conditions change, requirements change, don't they? So, the world in which, I don't know, nobody dies a natural death, we all gain different obligations to each other. The world in which suddenly nobody can walk, we all gain different obligations to each other. The world in which, insects die out and suddenly all of the species collapse, our conditions change. All I think we can really do is work out models to assess what's possible on the current constraints and be aware that we need to change those things. And I want to say something like the best possible society model. One advantage of it is that you can apply it to the moment, such that your answer that you come up with today is different from the answer you come up with in 10 years' time. Unfortunately, again, that gives you quite a thin answer, but sometimes it's better to have a justified thin answer than a harder to justify thick answer. Now, I'm aware we started 10 minutes late, so we'll do leave when you need to, obviously, but we'll carry on for an extra 10 minutes. But in 5 minutes' time, I think what we'll do is we will shift to the final half hour, which I'm keen to stick to, which is I will post on the group chat an extract from this month's Freedom Focused Philosophy text, and we'll have a bit of a debate about it. But before I do that in a couple of minutes' time, is there anybody who wants to add anything extra to this?
yes.
Please
So,
do. Thanks. Hi.
So Rebecca, my question
Hey.
is, does your book envision competing utopias that each person can apply to? And the reason I ask is, one man's utopia is another man's dystopia. And I can imagine a world with 100 competing utopias, each open to applications, but each being very, very selective. And I just wonder whether your book expects there to be competing utopias with an admissions committee, with most people who apply being rejected, or whether that's not the vision of your book.
So no, that's not the vision of my book. Again, that sounds quite like Nozick, who I have a lot of time for, and I think is opens up this question of, if a condition of utopia is that it's best in terms of meeting your subjective preferences, so the best place that you could imagine, which also you could possibly live in, something like that, then that is a model on which it's very open to competing utopias. The problem with my model for an answer like that is my model necessitates that there's only one possible utopia at any time, because it thinks of it as best. Now, that doesn't mean that the place that counts as utopia remains utopia. Like I say, there's no current utopia on my model. But that doesn't mean that the place that finally meets those conditions retains the status of utopia. So I think my answer is something like, you could have competing societies to be utopia, but only one of them can ever be utopia at any one time. Now, you might want to say, hey, but that actually just comes the same as what I'm saying. You're just calling these places non-utopias, whereas on my model, they are utopias. And I'd be happy to accept that. I just think we're using different conceptions of utopia, on which mine, that subjective constraint doesn't play such a big role. I'm not going to say that that the place meets the objective constraint if everyone's unhappy there. I'm just saying that subjective preference doesn't play the whole role. Does that answer your
I had
question?
Yeah, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks. Great question.
So I've been thinking about maybe this is a slightly tangential question or thought, but you started with the observation that a lot of utopias are depicted as being pretty unfree. And so I was thinking about why that would be. And you mentioned the Republic, and I haven't read the Republic in a while, but the thing that I think about sort of weirdly frequently is at the start of it, when Plato sort of starts out, or Socrates sort of starts out with this idea that like, hey, if everybody just lived in like small communities and they didn't want very much, everyone would be great. But it's because we want to like accumulate more and have more power and wealth that we form societies, and that means that we have to have the society structured in this way. And then it kind of kicks off. And sort of that got me thinking about the idea that to some extent societies have maybe inbuilt in them some vision of what they would like to accomplish or what's good. And so like I was thinking about Alistair McIntyre and the like you know the his After Virtue, where he talks about the idea of like virtues are basically the rules you play by when you're part of a community which has a particular goal that it's seeking to achieve. And so that would, if those sort of loosely related thoughts connect to one another, that would imply that any society is going to have some kind of inbuilt objective or vision of the good, and that there are a certain set of rules that flow from that vision of the good that they have to adhere to. And so if you're talking about a utopia where there's like as much freedom as possible, you would then have to have a conception where if part of that freedom is freedom to disagree about what constitutes the good, then you're going to have conflict, and you're going to end up with some sort of like lots of different little societies or like lots of different groups of people. So I don't know. I don't know that leads anywhere, but that's kind of what I was thinking about, just that question about like, why is it that utopias end up being depicted as unfree?
I think again, there's something to be said about the role that you allow for subjective preference. So if it's the case that the conception of the good that the people in the society end up gravitating towards is something that seems like a kind of impoverished conception of the good. So say they become very, I don't know, like self-aggrandizing. There's just this kind of culture, of bragging. There's this culture of like showing off. It might not be so bad that you don't want to say it's like, hey, they've got some evil kind of, cultural norm. But it's going to be hard, I think, to say that that's the kind of utopian governing value. So you might just want to discount some stuff on the grounds that it just doesn't count sufficiently. And in the same way that if you're going to be putting some constraints because the best possible society has to meet certain bars, you have to rule out certain things, then there comes a question as to, whilst pursuing your own chosen ends seems important in the best possible society, there are going to be some chosen ends that aren't going to be in they're not going to further the good, whether you see the good as some kind of Aristotelian basic human goods thing, or even if you see it in some aggregationist, welfare maximizing way, you're going to rule some stuff out. But I agree. I mean, this is one of the big questions, isn't it? Particularly if you're trying to use a notion like best. At this point, I'm just going to put in the group chat this little paragraph. This is from John Locke's second treatise, and it says some stuff about the consent point. So this, wait a sec, can everybody see this? And I just thought we'd end by thinking about a couple of questions. So why don't I just give you a minute to read it through? I just thought it'd be fun to end with some like doing philosophy in the sense of reading the classic philosophers. So I think if you take a literal interpretation at the full extent, he's basically saying something like, if whilst you're in a country you benefit in any way from being there, then you've effectively agreed to being bound by its laws. which sounds pretty hardcore, doesn't it? It sounds like the flip side of the thing that I was talking about earlier, that it's not just the power holders only have authority over you if you've given them your consent. It's like, hey, if you've given them their consent, they can do whatever they want. So two questions I think that arise from this are, one, is it really consent if you can have given it unknowingly? So if you didn't know that the consequence of traveling freely on the highway, and bear in mind you can interpret that as meaning benefiting from the public good that is the road that people have contributed to. It doesn't have to just be you're literally walking on the on a bit of land. So if it can be the case that you're being counted as consenting if you've done it unknowingly, are you really consenting, or is it something else? So it might well be the case that you want to say, hey, this seems like a reasonable condition, but should we call it a consent condition if you could do it without knowing, if you can accidentally be bound? And the second thing is the conditionality here. So let's take it that you do accept that this means you're bound by the laws. Okay, does that mean that that just holds for good regardless of the content of the laws? You know, let's imagine some new government comes in and passes some really, really horrible laws. Are you still bound? And if you are, does that being bound mean that you can't fight against it? Because there's a difference between saying you're bound by the content of the laws and you can never disagree with the laws, or you can never rise up and fight against the laws. So Locke famously thinks that there's space sometimes for rebellion. So how does that fit in? Let's just go around. You can say something about this, you can answer the questions, or you can talk about something entirely different. It's entirely up to you. But I thought it might be a kind of fun way to end, because Locke is obviously a very freedom-focused philosopher. But this seems quite constraining. If it's just the case that you're there and you're going on the street, and suddenly you've got to obey the law morally, that seems like quite an imposition. Tom, what do you think?
So what I would say this means is that if you have a possession in a territory governed by someone else, means that you outsource the need to secure such a possession to said government. It basically states that you are not a medieval baron and you are not responsible personally for the defense of the property you enjoy. By agreeing to submit to a government, you have the guarantee that you do not have to defend or what you own from others. And I would not say that this states that you cannot disagree with such a government. I think it only means that if you do choose to disagree, you then bear the responsibility of defending what it is you own.
So you might forfeit that protection that you've gained.
Yes, if you forfeit the authority of a government, you forfeit the protection of said government, which is why most of us prefer to live under some sort of government.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. But he does say, doesn't he, obliged to obedience to the laws of that government, which sounds broader than benefiting from property protection.
Well, you could be obliged under such a situation. Well, what they said is the possessions are part of the dominions of a government. If the possessions, if you declare those not as part of the dominions of the government, you must be prepared to accept the consequences thereof. If you do not give the consent, then therefore you are no longer part of the government.
Adam, what do you think?
Well, I don't know if you want to go in this direction, but I actually taught this passage last week, I think. And I was trying to understand the relationship between tacit consent and explicit consent in Locke. And in this passage, he, if I recall correctly, I think he's talking about a foreign visitor to a nation, and so not a member of the Commonwealth. And later on, like a few paragraphs after, so in that's from section 119, paragraph 119. In 122, he talks about how in order to be a member of the Commonwealth, nothing can make any man so, but his actually entering into it by positive engagement and express promise and compact. So just in terms of like what Locke is saying, he seems to think that there's like one level of agreement that is expressly given to form the state, and then after the state has been formed through express agreement, you can have people who are obliged to follow its laws merely by being within the state's domain. And that seems to me kind of plausible in that tacit consent to obey certain laws requires that people have already explicitly consented to live under those laws. There's there's some levels of filtering mechanisms, or there's different levels that prevent these laws you tacitly consent to from being too unjust in Locke's framework.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I always think there's this interesting point around if we do make this distinction between the people who have expressly consented, or how you're gonna cash that out, and the people who are taken to be tacitly consenting. It's like, how long do these things count for? Because this suggests that you're effectively persistently tacitly consenting, and then you would think, well, the people who one time expressly consented, if that's how it works, does that just count forever, or are they being counted as tacitly consenting? Because he's saying every man that hath possessions or enjoyment. So I think one way you can interpret it is saying something like, if you continue to participate. So some people have this almost democratic interpretation of Locke, don't they? Whereby by continuing to be part of that society, even if just by going on the streets, you're giving some kind of consent, which is kind of what we might translate into, being a political member of a society, voting, taking part in action, paying taxes. But yes, we then get on to different levels of citizenship. Trey, what do you think?
I can't help but think it's the constant state of both, meaning I accept it, but at the same time, I'm fighting to change it. And that's just always going to be the case. And it's like we're never going to reach that perfect utopia. We're just constantly evolving. And then also age plays a part of this, because I'm sure things I cared about 20 years ago are going to be very different than things I care about 20 years from now.
Could I expand on something Trey said?
Please.
Okay, so I spent a lot of time traveling the world searching for utopias. And what I realize is a utopia for a parent is totally different than a utopia for a teenager, right? Like if you ask every teenager in the world, they have a vision of utopia where there's polygamy and drugs are free, right? That's what all teenagers want. But then if you talk to parents, pretty much all parents want a monogamous society without drugs for their children. Therefore, I think the concept of a one size fits all utopia is silly. I think there has to be different versions of utopia. And I think that Trey was getting at that. I'm done speaking.
So one thing you might want to say is something like, there's many different ways to live a good life. There are also some bad ways to live a life. You might want to expect, though, that the place you count as utopia has space for people with different conceptions of the good life. The question then is, do you want to say that they're all living in different utopias, or do you want to say that your utopia would have space for people with competing overall worldviews? Something like that. But I'm aware we're running out of time. Jess, let's go to you.
First, I just want to follow up on what was just said, because it interests me. It makes me think about like the Constitution and how so many people think that the Constitution should just be like left alone, even though the founders said that it should grow with society, and as society progresses and grows, much like, we all do grow as human beings and become adults. You know, the country was founded, it was very young, and it should grow. So it makes me think of that. We had a utopian idea of what the United States should be when the Constitution was written. And so just an interesting thought popped into my head when that was said. When I look at this quote, though, at first I saw it and I was like, oh, like I got this like reaction that made me think about like that. It was just like very visceral, and it made me think like in a very weird way, like you know, a woman goes out to dinner, and because she gets dinner, like obviously that's tacit consent for what's going to happen after dinner, and it's not, you know, it's not consent. But then it makes you also think like, well, if I travel to Barcelona, isn't it tacit consent for me as like a visitor in the country of Spain to like follow their laws? Like I'm not going to go over there and just, you know, start robbing things and murdering people as a visitor of Barcelona. So like there's this like weird idea. But then I really liked what Trey said, that we're always going to be trying to change it and make it better. And there's going to be this back and forth of what we think laws are going to be. So it's just really interesting the way it can be perceived through different lenses and read.
Yeah, I really like that. After all, it might just because a law might bind you in some ways doesn't mean it's going to bind you in all ways. And this again comes back to whether it's a point about conditionality. So whether it's that you're bound to certain laws or whether it's you're only bound within. So I don't know, the lawmaker has control over some particular aspect, but then they act really badly. So just because maybe it's the case that they're justified to take some tax from you, that doesn't mean they can come into your house and like steal it out of your purse. Like you might want to have some prerequisites, in other words, on you know, on what's legitimate. Tom.
So, could you repeat that question, please?
I was just wondering if you wanted to respond to Jess or to the group or to the quotation any further. It looked like you wanted to say something. It was mostly my point.
Okay. Oh, so what I was going to say in regards to this quotation and also to something that Jess said is that societies do grow. That's certainly true. They do change, but so they do not remain in adulthood. They do eventually become senile and eventually fall. And I would say that having written rules for a society, having a specific charter of a society, as any of these utopian societies would have, I assume that many people might want different charters from each other, hence the reason for separate city-states. The rules prevent the society from decaying prematurely, and societies with no written rules, you can say with pretty good evidence, end up providing an inferior quality of life to their citizens than do societies with clearly written rules. A society with no written rules will oftentimes fail with the death of its leader or his assassination or removal by other means. So what I would say is that written rules, such as a constitution, prevent a society from aging before its time. And hence, any such utopia, it helps keep them clearly defined if there is a clear set of rules which they are following. And it is certainly true, I would say, that the rules define the course of history. They don't react. The rules create how society is originated, and how it evolves is set by those rules.
Keshav?
Yeah, the point that Jess made, that okay, the dinner, you give explicit consent for the dinner, but you don't give explicit consent for what comes after. So in the real world, I think explicit consent comes paired up with a bunch of tacit consents, and the ability to decouple them is a metric for a utopia, in my opinion. That if you can decouple them, okay, I went for dinner, but now I have the ability to say no to something else. So that's a better society than a society that doesn't have that possibility. Same with the countries, that if you can create these boundaries, that okay, I'm going to Spain, so I have to follow these laws, but I also bring some power of my own to decouple, to not follow some rules. And I think from your point of concentric circles of power, so that might be the efficient version of it, but the effective version of it should be overlapping circles of power instead of a concentric circles of power which just increase in the degree of power they have. So concentric circles will have lower ability to decouple, versus overlapping influence and power circles will have higher ability to decouple these tacit and explicit consents.
It's nice. I like that thought. I like that thought very much. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I have a few different reactions to it, but I won't go into all of it. I suppose the one thing I was thinking about actually is the idea of, well, I was thinking, okay, consent is weird in a situation where it can't be withdrawn. And I suppose it made me think that maybe part of what's happening here that sounds odd to me is that in John Locke's day, there weren't firm national borders. Like, borders were largely porous, people could move pretty easily. And so the idea of withdrawing your consent, or deciding that you're not going to enjoy whatever a government is giving you, like, that was kind of not easy, but legally possible. Whereas now, like, sure, I enjoy the fact that I have like roads that can bring goods to me and things like that. But I also don't have the ability to not enjoy those things, right? Like, basically no matter what I do, as long as I am in this country, I'm going to have some benefits and some harms from the system of laws that's enacted. And for people who don't have multiple nationalities, or who don't live like in the EU, there's nothing you can do about that. Like, you can leave on vacation, but you can't just pick up and move. And so you can't actually withdraw consent in the way that you actually, legally speaking, I suppose you could in John Locke's day. Like, you could move. Economically speaking, probably much harder, but that's, I guess I don't know John Locke that well. I would imagine that he's less attuned to the economic challenges of his views. But so I guess it just got me thinking down a path of like the historical change that has come about from the fact that since the 20th century we now have pretty hard borders which enforce our sort of living in certain countries, or
It's a very
in
nice
a
point.
country.
It's a great point, because like Hume's big criticism of, or one of his big criticisms of Locke was this point about exit costs. But you're right. I mean, it seems like nothing compared to today, does it really? I mean, even just in the literal sense, not just the kind of implied exit cost sense of like, oh, it's going to be hard or whatever. It like you say, you can go on holiday, but and okay, maybe you can just stay there, but good luck on that.
I mean, that was another thought I had, is that, like, you may have noticed that of late in the US, there's some discussion of what it means to be subject to the jurisdiction of a government. And in John Locke's telling, if you enjoy some benefit from that government, you're subject to its jurisdiction, which, maybe that's going to be relevant for the Supreme Court. That's nice. It's like a nice piece of contemporary relevance for a text. But we'll see.
Yeah. John, any further thoughts?
Unfortunately, I don't really think I have anything defined enough that I'm comfortable bringing up. So,
Oh, sorry. Well, in that case, I think we're pretty much out of time. Sorry, that's gone very quickly, hasn't it? Thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed this. I feel like we have much more to say, but I think we've also covered some pretty big questions. So thank you. Hopefully might see you again for some of these other ones. We're going to be next time, like I say, we're going to be discussing rights and obligations. We've also got other fun stuff along the way, stuff about economics, stuff about culture, stuff about prisons at some point coming up soon. So yeah, if you have an interest in any of those particular things, or just a kind of on-running interest in political philosophy or freedom or anything like this, then love to see you again. And thank you. Thanks very much for this. I really enjoyed it. It was great to do a bit of philosophy.
Thank you. This was a great meeting. I learned a lot, Rebecca.
Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I've learned
thank you. This
I've
is
really
great.
enjoyed it.
This was really